Loops permit us to take repeated action. In the Python programming language, we have two main kinds of loops. We have the while loop and the for loop. Now, if the number of actions we're about to take aren't known initially, we generally use the while loop. In the case where this number of actions are already known, we generally use the for loop. But there are ways of actually using any of them in either case, although the for loop is more limited as compared to the while loop. Now, let's take some examples of how we use this in the Python programming language. Say we want to print out I am at position 1, and then we'll do this. So we want to print out I am at position 2, 3, 4, and then 5. We want to do this 5 times repeatedly. Now, if this n, or in this case we have n equals 5, that is, we want to do this n times. In this case, n equals 5, so we'll do this 5 times. Now, if this n tends to 500, we'll have to repeat this 500 times, and that's not very efficient. So to solve this problem, we could use a for loop where we just simply say for I in range 5, we have print I am at position I. You have to put I, and there we go. We could replace this with n. Since n is this, for now we have that. I will launch this. We have this. We have I am at position this. There's an error here. We haven't put this format of I. Take this away. I'll run this. Throw this an error. I'll take this away, and we have this. So we find out we have this. Now, for the for loop, when you have this for whatever in a range, generally what happens here is the range has a start index and an end index. Once you have only one value in here, the start index by default is 0. So in this case, it's the same as putting this. So actually, this is this, or rather with a comma. So we have this. So doing this is the same as having range 0, comma n. Now, this is the same as doing this simply. So range n. Now that we have this, what actually this loop does is goes from 0 right up to n minus 1. This is very similar to when we were working with lists, where we had a list, say 1, 3, 4, and if we wanted to list out some elements, this would take us from 0 to 2 instead of from 0 to 3. So doing this gave us 0, this, and this. So if we print out this, we're gonna have 1, 3, 4. Now coming back to the for loop, this simply means if we work in here, we are gonna have for I in range. Recall the in operator, where we're gonna take this variable we're creating. So we're gonna take for I, for all this i's in this range. Now this range goes from 0 to n minus 1. So what we're saying here is for all I which goes from 0 to n minus 1, repeat this statement or repeat this action. So for all I going from 0 to n minus 1, we are going to print I am at position I. And so when I equals 0, we're going to print I am at position 0. When I equals 1, I am at position 1, and so on and so forth. So we see that we actually replace this now with this. If you notice, here we're printing from 0, and that's because the default stat index is 0. So let's modify this. We have 1, and we'll print that out. Now let's take off this. We run this, we see that we go from 1 to 4, and that's because we have right up to the n index minus 1. So if we want to print up to 5, we could simply put here n plus 1, and doing this now, we have from 1 to 5. And if we want to go to 500, all we need to do is to run this, and we simply go, we see how we are able to go from this to 500. And so that's it. That's how the for loop works. Let's reduce this, and we have that. Now we can take this off. Now it's important to note that with loops, generally we have an initial statement, and then we have an increment. So in this case, we have the initial statement, or we have the initial value of I to be equal to 0, or in this case 1. So in this case, the initial value of I is 1, and then we increment its value up to where we reach n plus 1 minus 1. So if we have this, we'll basically increment its value from 0 to n minus 1. So let's look at the while loop. Taking the while loop, it actually works a little bit different. For a while loop, if we want to do this same action, that is print this, say n times, we have n equals 5 in this case, we could simply have while n is, say, less than 5. So while we have this condition, we repeat whatever we have here. So while n is less than 5, we have print I am at position this. So we have that format I. Now notice this is a little bit different. Like the I doesn't come in this. Unlike the for loop where this I came with a for, here we just have this while n less than 5. So we just have this condition. Now we have to declare the I separately, so we can have I initially at 0, and then whenever we reach in this, we could put this I plus equals 1. Now this I plus equals 1 is simply saying I is equals I plus 1. So if I is 0 and it gets n here, it will turn into 1. Since it turns into 1, it's going to continue, and so on and so forth. So let's run this and see what we have. Running this, we see that nothing is printed, and that is logical because n is equals 5. So we are saying here that while n is less than 5, we should continue doing this. Given that n is always equals 5 and it's not changing actually when we get into this, we are never going to get into this. So actually once it reaches here, n is less than 5, we don't have any other place where n turns to 5 or where n turns to a value less than 5, so we're never going to get into this loop. So what we can do is we can modify this. We have here I, so while I is less than 5, and then we keep on incrementing. Now we see here that initially I is already less than 5 since I is equal to 0. So we are obviously going to get into this loop, and we're going to print this out. So while I is less than 5, we keep on doing this, and once I turns 5, since I has been incremented, we are going to go out of this loop. So let's run this and see what we get. So this is exactly what we wanted to have. So we have this. Let's reduce this value, or let's take n to be equals to 3, and we'll take I less than n. So run this now, and this one. Now let's go step by step and see what happens exactly. At the beginning, we have n equals 3 and I equals 0. So we have that. When this comes here, we have I 0 and n 3. 0 is obviously less than 3. So we're going to come in here and print out. So we print out this value with 0. So that's why we have this. Once this is printed out, I turns to 1. And since I is 1, I is less than 3. So we still come in here and print this out. Once that is printed out, it prints out this 1. That is, it prints out I am at position 0. So this actually represents I am at position. So let's write this out like this. I am at position whatever. I am at position. So we have this. I am at position. Okay, so we have that. And once it prints this 1 out, it sends I to 2. And that's because I is incremented here. So with a while loop, we actually do this incrementation by hand, of which with a for loop, we didn't have to do this. It does this automatically. So we have that. And then since I is equals 2, 2 is less than 3, that's strictly less than 3. So it still gets into the loop. And then we print out I am at position 2. Once it prints this out, I turns to 3. But 3 isn't strictly less than 3. So it goes out of the loop, and that's why all what you get printed here is this 3 different outputs. Now we could simply modify this to I plus 1, and we'll find here that we have this. So we have 1, 2, 3 as expected. Now we could send this to 5. Could send this to 500. And that's what's expected. So let's modify this. And there we go. So that's basically how the while and the for loops work. Now let's come back to the problem we had initially, where we had these different sports, and we wondered that if a player actually plays any of the sports, it should be printed out. We saw how difficult it was to go using only conditions. So let's look for a new way of solving that problem. So we could simply say here that for I in range, the length of spots. Now we should understand why we're using this length of spots. So for I in range, length of spots, we're going to say, for example, print I. So running this, we see that we have this. This tells us that the length of spots is actually equals 2, because this is for I in range. This is the same as I in range 2. That's because sports actually contains these 2 elements. So it's this list with 2 elements. So its length is actually 2. So that's why we have the 0, 1. Let's take this away. We could even add the other sports here. So we have volleyball, and that's it. So here we have for I in range, length sports, printed this I, print it again. See that we have this now. We could actually even print length sports before. So we have length sports, and that's it. It tells us that this is 3. Now we can say that if that's for a particular I, if sports I. Now we know that sports 0, for example, is basically this football string. Sports 1 is this, and sports 2 is this. So if a particular sports I is equals, very important to put those brackets. It makes your work neat. So if sports I is actually equals football, we're gonna print out I am a footballer. And then we have if sports I is equals basketball, print out. So this is actually to one space front. We have print I am a basketballer. And finally, we have if sports I equals volleyball. So let's put a string volleyball. We'll print out I am a volleyballer. And that's it. So let's run this and see what we get. Now, given that we have football, basketball, and volleyball, we have I am a footballer, I am a basketballer, and I am a volleyballer. Now, if we take off one of this, we simply have this. So this shows how easy it is to work with loops while trying to solve that problem. We could replace here, simply have is. So if this is this, see that it doesn't change anything. So that's it. Now there's another way of looking at these loops. Instead of working like this, let's copy this here. Copying this here, we have, instead of saying for I in range length of this, that's for going through each and every index, we could simply say for I in sports, or we could say for sport, that's a singular, and then this is a plural. So for sport in sports, if a particular sport is football, print this. If that sport is basketball, print that. If that sport is volleyball, print this. So that's how we go. And we see that we have exactly the same results. So instead of going through the indices, sports I and whatever other index, we simply go by each of the elements. So we say for sport in sports. So what happens here is we're going to start with the first this, and then we'll try test here, and test there. And then we go to the next, we're going to test. So that's how it works. Now, if you, for example, make an error here, you can have this. So we see that since this is not the same as this, that doesn't work out well. So let's put this back, and that's it. Now you can add other sports. You could add tennis, for example, and simply just put out this. So we have elif, or if you put else, print, they should give you I am a tennis player. So we have this, and that's because in this case, when we test this, for example, that's for the first case, since sport equals football at the beginning, it goes into this. And then for the next case, since sport equals volleyball, we test and it works out with this. For the next case, since sport actually equals tennis, it doesn't match with this, it doesn't match with this, it doesn't match with this. So the else actually takes this, and that's why we have I am a tennis player. Now let's look at the break, pass, and continue keywords, which are greatly used in loops. Now suppose we have this. We want that every time we have a footballer, we should simply break. So we could have a break, and doing this, once you get into this and you have this break, we go out of this for loop. So we should see that when we print this, we have just I am a footballer. And that's because once we got this, we took a break and we left this for loop. Now if you take this, have break, see that it prints this out. Since there is no basketball here, it doesn't even get here, so everything is printed out. Now if this break is actually put here, or put here, for example, you see that footballer is printed, basketballer is printed, or rather footballer is printed, volleyballer is printed, but tennis player is not printed because at this point we leave the loop. Now let's look at how continue or pass works. So suppose we reach at this point, we could have continue. So running this, we see that everything works actually fine. Now suppose we want to have a certain value here, so we say we take this a to be equals true. So initially a is true, and we say here that we're gonna continue from this point. So we have a equals false, and then we're gonna print out a. So let's run this. We see that actually a is equals true. The reason why a is true, whereas we actually got into this and we sent a to false, is simply because once we get to this continue, what happens is this continue tells us to go to the next iteration. Now notice or recall that working with loops is basically iterating over these indices. So we start with this, we go to this, and we go to this. So once we come to this football and we have this continue, automatically after printing this, we go directly to the next iteration. We don't bother about the remaining part of the code. So no matter what you put out here, so if you put this hello, normally you shouldn't have anything here, and that's because this continue tells us to go to the next iteration immediately. So that's how continue works. And then we also have pass. So with this, suppose you have this and you don't want to actually print out whatever, so you could just simply say pass, because if you take this off, you're gonna have an error. And now sometimes you may not have anything to put here, so you may not have any action to take. So you just want to have this condition and then maybe another condition, say if sport is handball, or say hand, then here you want to print something. So you say you want to print hello, and in this case take this off, take this out. And once we get into this condition, we don't want to print any value or print it out whatever, so we just simply have this pass. So that's it for this section. The next section we shall be working on Python functions